Something happened that your soulmate never expected to understand, and once they saw it clearly, they couldn't look away. There was a missing piece in your story that had been sitting quietly between the memories, the silence, the distance, and all those moments neither of you ever fully explained. For a long time, they thought they understood what happened between you. They told themselves certain moments were coincidences, certain feelings were temporary, and certain memories would eventually lose their meaning. But recently something changed. They looked back at one particular moment from the past, and suddenly it felt completely different. Details they once ignored began connecting with things that happened later. A conversation, a reaction, a silence, even something you may have forgotten began forming a pattern they could no longer dismiss. And this is where the story becomes truly unexpected, because your soulmate didn't discover that they had forgotten you. They discovered something much deeper about why they could never completely forget you. The moment that realization settled into their heart, they stopped searching for reasons to move on and started asking a completely different question. What if the part of the story they were missing had been right in front of them all along? There is one memory your soulmate keeps returning to, and what makes it so powerful is that they never understood its importance when it first happened. At the time, it may have seemed like an ordinary conversation, a simple exchange, a look that lasted a little longer than expected, or even a moment that ended before either of you had the courage to say what was really being felt. They moved forward afterward, or at least they tried to convince themselves they had. Life became busy, circumstances changed, and other things demanded their attention. Yet somehow, that particular memory never completely disappeared. It remained quietly stored somewhere inside them, appearing again during unexpected moments, especially when everything around them became quiet. They used to wonder why that happened. Why would one small moment continue to carry so much emotional weight when so many other memories had faded? They couldn't explain it. They tried to call it nostalgia. They tried to tell themselves that perhaps they were simply remembering a beautiful time in their life. But recently, something made them look at that memory differently. They began noticing details they had completely overlooked before. They remembered the way you looked at them, the words you chose, the hesitation in your voice, the feeling that seemed to pass between you without either person naming it. And suddenly, what once seemed insignificant began feeling like a clue. Your soulmate started connecting that moment to everything that happened afterward, and the connection became difficult to ignore. They remembered how their emotions changed after that encounter, how they started thinking about you differently, how certain conversations stayed in their mind long after they ended, and how your presence somehow continued to follow them, even when you were no longer physically around. The strange part is that they may have spent a long time believing they were simply holding on to the past, when in reality, they were holding on to a question that had never been answered. Why did that moment affect them so deeply? Why did something so simple leave such a lasting impression? Why did they feel something they couldn't explain and then spend so much time trying to make sense of it? These questions began returning with a completely different intensity, and the more they thought about them, the more they realized that the memory wasn't powerful because of what happened on the surface. It was powerful because of what they felt underneath it. There was something unspoken there, something neither of you fully acknowledged, something that may have been too vulnerable or too complicated to understand at the time. Your soulmate is beginning to recognize that now. They are realizing that sometimes the moments that change us don't announce themselves when they arrive. They simply happen, and we only understand their importance after enough time has passed for us to see what they set in motion. That is exactly what seems to be happening here. Your soulmate is looking backward and realizing that the story did not unfold through one dramatic event. It unfolded through a series of small moments that slowly created an emotional connection neither of you could fully explain. One memory led them to another. One conversation reminded them of another. One feeling suddenly explained something they had questioned for years. And as those pieces began coming together, they started seeing your connection through completely different eyes. They began wondering whether they had misunderstood you, misunderstood themselves, or misunderstood what that chapter of their life was actually trying to teach them. Most importantly, they began realizing that perhaps they weren't supposed to forget that memory at all. Perhaps it stayed because it was carrying information they weren't emotionally ready to understand before. And now that they are finally looking at it without the same fear, defensiveness, or confusion, the meaning feels different. It feels deeper. It feels personal. It feels connected to everything that happened afterward. But there is still one part they haven't fully understood yet, and this is where everything becomes even more interesting. Because when they placed that memory beside the other moments they shared with you, they noticed something they could no longer explain away. There was a pattern, and once they saw that pattern, they couldn't stop looking for the next piece. And once your soulmate saw that pattern, something inside them shifted, because the memories were no longer appearing as separate moments. They were beginning to look like pieces of the same story, pieces that had been scattered for a long time and were only now falling into place. They started thinking about the way certain moments with you seemed to happen at exactly the right time, even when neither of you understood why. They remembered conversations that unexpectedly became deeper than they intended, moments when they felt unusually understood, and times when your presence seemed to affect them long after you were gone. What surprised them most was realizing how often they had tried to explain those experiences away. Whenever something felt too meaningful, they found a logical reason for it. Whenever they noticed themselves becoming emotionally attached, they pulled back. Whenever a memory became too powerful, they convinced themselves it was simply the past. But now, looking at everything together, those explanations no longer felt complete. Your soulmate began recognizing a pattern in their own behavior. They noticed that every time they tried to move forward without truly understanding what happened between you, something would bring the connection back into their thoughts. It could be a familiar place, a certain song, a conversation with someone else, an unexpected reminder, or simply a quiet night when their mind had nowhere left to hide. And each time the same feeling returned. Not necessarily the same emotion, but the same unfinished question. Why did this person leave such a lasting impact on me? That question became more difficult to ignore because they started realizing that you had not simply been another chapter in their life. Something about the connection had challenged the way they understood themselves. You may have awakened emotions they weren't prepared to handle. You may have shown them a version of themselves they had forgotten existed. You may have made them realize how deeply they could care, how vulnerable they could become, or how much fear had influenced their decisions. And that realization was uncomfortable because it meant the missing piece wasn't only about you, it was also about them. For perhaps the first time, they began understanding that the connection had exposed something they had spent years avoiding. They had been asking why they couldn't forget you, when perhaps the better question was why they had worked so hard to forget what the connection taught them. That changed the entire meaning of the past. Suddenly, the distance didn't look exactly the same. The silence didn't look exactly the same. Even the moments that once felt like missed opportunities began carrying a different meaning. Your soulmate started seeing how fear, timing, uncertainty, and unspoken emotions had influenced the story. They realized there may have been moments when they wanted to say more but didn't know how. Moments when they wanted to move closer but became afraid. Moments when they chose silence because silence felt safer than vulnerability. And now they were looking at those moments with greater honesty. They weren't simply remembering what happened. They were recognizing why they behaved the way they did. That distinction mattered, because when someone finally understands the reason behind their own actions, the past can suddenly become clearer. Your soulmate began seeing that perhaps they hadn't been confused about you as much as they had been confused about themselves. They had feelings they didn't know how to name, fears they didn't know how to confront, and questions they didn't know how to ask. So instead of facing them, they allowed time to create distance and hoped the unanswered parts would eventually disappear. But they didn't. They remained quietly connected to every memory that still carried emotional weight. And now, as those memories began forming one larger picture, your soulmate reached a realization that made them stop and think. Maybe the reason they couldn't look away wasn't because they were trapped in the past. Maybe they couldn't look away because the past was finally showing them something they were supposed to understand. The moments were pointing toward the same truth again and again, and that truth was becoming harder to dismiss. You had affected them more deeply than they ever admitted, and the connection had changed something inside them that time alone could not erase. But there was still one uncomfortable question waiting beneath that realization. If they finally understood what the connection meant, why had they spent so much time running from it? And that question was about to force them to confront the part of the story they had been most afraid to face. There was a reason your soulmate had been so hesitant to look too deeply into everything they felt. And now they were beginning to understand why. The truth was not frightening because it was painful. It was frightening because accepting it meant they could no longer hide behind uncertainty. For a long time, it was easier for them to say they didn't know what the connection meant than to admit that they already knew it mattered. They could blame timing, circumstances, distance, confusion, or the things that happened between you, but none of those explanations could completely silence what they felt inside. And now that the pieces were beginning to connect, those explanations were losing their power. Your soulmate started asking themselves questions they had avoided for far too long. What if they had misunderstood what you meant to them? What if the reason they kept remembering you wasn't because they were stuck, but because something inside them had never truly found closure? What if the moments they once considered insignificant were actually the moments that revealed the deepest truth? These questions were uncomfortable because every honest answer brought them closer to vulnerability. They realized that admitting how much the connection affected them would mean admitting that they had not been as unaffected as they pretended to be. There were moments when they missed you, but remained silent. Moments when they wanted to reach out, but convinced themselves there was no reason. Moments when they wondered whether you ever thought about them, yet were too afraid to discover the answer. They had protected themselves by keeping everything undefined. If they never named the feeling, they never had to risk being rejected by it. If they never admitted the importance of the connection, they could always pretend it had simply been another chapter that ended naturally. But now that story no longer felt honest to them. Something had changed inside their perspective. They were beginning to understand that silence had protected them from immediate discomfort, but it had not protected them from regret. In fact, the longer they avoided the truth, the more questions they carried. And perhaps the most difficult question of all was this: what would have happened if they had been brave enough to acknowledge everything sooner? They imagined different versions of the past. In one version, they remained silent, continued pretending, and allowed the years to carry the connection farther away. That future felt safe because nothing had to be risked, but it also felt strangely empty. Then they imagined another possibility, one where they stopped hiding from what they felt and finally allowed themselves to be honest. That future was uncertain. It could not guarantee an outcome. It could not promise that everything would suddenly become perfect. But strangely, it felt more peaceful. And that difference told them something important. They weren't necessarily afraid of the truth itself. They were afraid of what the truth might require them to do. Your soulmate began realizing that sometimes the hardest decision isn't choosing between two people. Sometimes it is choosing between the version of yourself that feels safe and the version of yourself that is finally willing to be honest. They had spent so much time protecting their heart that they had forgotten what it felt like to listen to it. But now they were listening, and what they heard wasn't a demand to chase the past or force something that wasn't meant to happen. It was something much quieter. It was an acknowledgement. You mattered. The connection mattered. The memories mattered. And whatever happened next, pretending otherwise would no longer make sense. That realization brought a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the time that had passed, for the words that were never spoken, and for the moments that might have unfolded differently. But there was also relief, because they finally understood why certain memories had refused to disappear. They weren't random. They were reminders of something their heart had never completely finished processing. And now, standing on the edge of that realization, your soulmate understood that the missing piece wasn't simply another memory or another coincidence. It was the truth they had been too afraid to acknowledge about themselves and about the impact you had on their life. For the first time, they weren't asking whether the connection had mattered. They were asking what they were going to do now that they finally understood why it mattered. And that question changed everything, because once the truth becomes clear, staying exactly where you were becomes much harder than taking the next step. And now, your soulmate finally understands what they had been unable to see for so long, and this realization is changing the way they look at the entire story between you. The missing piece was never simply one forgotten conversation, one unexplained memory, or one moment that happened years ago. It was the understanding that all those moments were connected by something they had been unwilling to acknowledge. They can now look back and see that certain memories remained because they carried emotional meaning. Certain questions remained because they were never honestly answered. And certain feelings survived because they were never completely resolved. For the first time, your soulmate isn't trying to force an explanation or convince themselves that everything was meaningless. They are allowing themselves to recognize what the connection actually did to them. You became part of a chapter that changed the way they understand love, vulnerability, timing, and even themselves. They may not have realized it while everything was happening, but now they can see that your presence exposed emotions they had kept hidden from almost everyone, including themselves. And that is why they couldn't look away when the missing piece finally appeared. They weren't simply looking at you or remembering you. They were looking at a version of themselves that existed because they had known you. A version that had felt deeply, hoped quietly, questioned everything, and discovered that some connections leave an impact even when life doesn't unfold exactly as expected. Suddenly, the moments that once seemed disconnected began making sense together. The silence had a reason. The hesitation had a reason. The distance had a reason. Even the moments when they seemed to move on had a deeper story underneath them. They realized that moving forward doesn't always mean forgetting, and forgetting was never the true measure of whether something mattered. Sometimes people carry a connection because it taught them something they weren't ready to understand at the time. Your soulmate is beginning to see that now. They also understand something else that may be even more important. They cannot rewrite the past, but they can choose what they do with the truth they have discovered today. They no longer want fear to decide everything for them. They no longer want uncertainty to keep them trapped in endless questions. They no longer want to look back years from now and wonder whether they should have been more honest. That doesn't mean they suddenly have every answer. It means they finally understand the question that matters most. Instead of asking, was this connection real? They are asking, what am I willing to do now that I know what it meant to me? And that is a completely different place to stand, because the missing piece gave them something they had been searching for all along: clarity. Not perfect certainty, not a guarantee about the future, but enough clarity to stop pretending that their feelings never mattered. They now recognize that you left an imprint on their heart that cannot simply be explained away by time or distance. They understand why certain memories return when they least expect them. They understand why certain moments still carry emotional weight. They understand why part of them kept looking back, even while another part tried desperately to move forward. And perhaps the most beautiful realization is that the story doesn't have to be forced into one specific ending for its meaning to be real. Sometimes the greatest revelation is simply understanding what a person meant to you and allowing that truth to change the way you move forward. Your soulmate has reached that point now. They are no longer standing in the same confusion where this story began. Something inside them has become quieter because something inside them has finally been understood. And if you have been wondering why this connection has continued to feel unfinished, perhaps this is the piece you were never able to see. It wasn't necessarily that something was missing from the story. The missing piece was the meaning hidden inside everything that had already happened. Your soulmate finally saw it, and once they did, they couldn't look away. They could only sit with the realization that some people enter our lives and leave behind memories, while others enter our lives and leave behind transformation. Whatever the future holds, one truth now stands stronger than the confusion that came before. This connection mattered. It changed something, and the person who once couldn't understand why is finally beginning to understand.